The bar was an organism, breathing in the thick, humid air of the Japanese coast and exhaling a composite sigh of stale beer, fried food, and regret. It clung to the edge of the Yokosuka naval base like a barnacle, a place of transition where the rigid geometry of military life dissolved into the messier, more fluid dynamics of liberty. The sounds within its walls were a low, constant roar, the percussive clack of billiard balls, the electronic chirps and synthetic explosions of an ancient arcade machine, and the overlapping strata of loud, confident voices, mostly American, all male. The light was a jaundiced yellow, buzzing from long fluorescent tubes that cast everything in a sickly, interrogative glow. The floor was perpetually sticky, a testament to countless spilled drinks and shattered illusions. It was a place built for noise, for the boisterous release of tension that followed weeks at sea or grueling months in the field. It was a cathedral of bravado. She sat alone at a small, scarred table in the corner, a deliberate island of quiet in the churning sea of sound. She was unremarkable to the point of being nearly invisible, a study in neutrals. Her clothes were simple and functional, dark, practical trousers and a plain gray shirt that fit well but offered no hint of fashion or statement. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, functional knot at the nape of her neck, a style that prioritized efficiency over aesthetics. There was nothing about her that invited a second glance. She was not young, but not old. Her face was a map of focused concentration, but its features were plain, unadorned by makeup or jewelry, save for a simple, rugged-looking watch on her wrist. She held a glass of water, condensation tracing clean lines down its side, and she stared into the middle distance, not with the vacant look of boredom, but with the focused stillness of a predator waiting in a blind. Her presence was a paradox. She was utterly still, yet she seemed to be the only thing in the room that possessed true substance, the chaotic motion of everyone else feeling frantic and flimsy by comparison. Across the room, Gunnery Sergeant Miller was holding court. He was the sun around which the lesser planets of his fire team orbited. He was a caricature of a Marine NCO, sculpted from granite, gristle, and institutional pride. His jaw was a right angle, his neck was thicker than a mooring line, and his arms, covered in a tapestry of faded tattoos depicting eagles, anchors, and skulls, looked like they could rip the bar's heavy oak door from its hinges. His voice was a gravelly boom, a finely tuned instrument of command that he now used to narrate a story of some bar fight in a forgotten port, embellishing each punch and every insult for the benefit of his rapt audience. Authority radiated from him like heat from a furnace, but it was a specific, limited kind of authority. The kind that thrived on loud talk, physical presence, and the rigid hierarchy of the uniform he wasn't currently wearing, but which was present in his every gesture and utterance. He was a king in this small, sticky kingdom, his confidence absolute, his worldview a simple binary of strong versus weak, insider versus outsider. It was inevitable that his gaze, sweeping his domain for tribute and affirmation, would eventually land on the quiet corner, on the small, still woman who was so profoundly out of place. His story faltered for a half-second. His brain, conditioned to categorize and assess, ran into a processing error. She did not fit. She wasn't a giggling tourist. She wasn't a local bar girl. She wasn't a weary military spouse. She was an anomaly, and anomalies in a controlled environment were either a threat or a target for mockery. His ego, large and easily bruised, chose the latter. Her quiet was not serene to him. It was a judgment. Her stillness was not calm. It was an affront. He saw her as a void in the boisterous tapestry of his evening, and he felt an overwhelming compulsion to fill it with noise. He grinned, a slow, predatory spreading of his lips that his subordinates recognized as the prelude to some form of casual cruelty. "Well, well, what do we have here?" he boomed, his voice slicing through the general din and causing a small pocket of silence to form around him. He pushed himself away from his table, the legs of his chair scraping a protest against the grimy floor. The other Marines in his circle chuckled, sensing sport. He ambled over to her table, his gait a proprietary swagger, the walk of a man who had never once questioned his right to be anywhere he chose. He planted his massive hands on the scarred wood of her small table, leaning his weight on them, effectively caging her in. The smell of cheap beer and masculine sweat washed over her. She did not flinch. She did not look up. Her eyes remained fixed on that point in the middle distance, her posture unchanged. It was as if he were a ghost, a transparent inconvenience she had decided to ignore. This was not the reaction he expected. He expected fear, or at least a nervous deference. Her utter lack of response was like a glove to the face. It was insolence. He leaned closer, his voice dropping from a boom to a conspiratorial, condescending growl. "Lost, little lady? This isn't the place for, well, for whatever you are. This is a Marine bar." He said the word Marine as if it were a sacred invocation, a password she could not possibly know. The implication was clear. This was his church, and she was a heathen in the pews. He was offering her a chance to explain herself, to justify her presence in his hallowed ground. Her eyes finally moved. They shifted from the middle distance and rose, slowly, deliberately, to meet his. They were a pale, washed-out blue, the color of a winter sky over a cold sea. There was no fear in them. There was no anger. There was nothing but a flat, analytical assessment, as if she were a scientist studying a particularly uninteresting specimen of mold. The silence stretched, becoming a tangible thing. It was her silence against his noise, and her silence was winning. It was making him uncomfortable. It was making his Marines shift on their feet. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was low and clear, devoid of any discernible emotion. It was the voice of a person who chooses their words with immense precision. "I'm waiting," she said. Just that. 2 words. They hung in the air, a stunning rejection of his entire premise. He had demanded to know who she was, to what tribe she belonged. She had answered a completely different question, one that existed only in her own mind. The response was so far outside his expected parameters that it short-circuited his brain. "Waiting," he scoffed, recovering his bluster. "Waiting for what? Prince Charming? You're in the wrong fairy tale, sweetheart. The only thing you're going to find in here is a whole lot of trouble." To punctuate his point, he deliberately nudged her table with his hip. It was a petty, childish display of physical dominance. The table rocked, and her glass of water, full and heavy with condensation, slid across the surface and tipped over, shattering on the floor with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the suddenly tense room. Water and shards of glass spread across the grimy linoleum. The gunnery sergeant laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Clumsy," he said, as if the table had moved on its own. The woman's gaze dropped from his eyes to the mess on the floor. For a long moment, she just looked at it. The narrator, from an omniscient perch, might have described her as a lioness allowing a jackal to dance at the edge of its kill radius, measuring, calculating, and finding the creature so profoundly beneath its notice that even the act of swatting it away felt like a waste of energy. She did not react with anger. She did not call for the bartender. She simply bent down, her movements fluid and economical, and began to pick up the larger pieces of broken glass, placing them carefully on a napkin. Her calm was unnatural. It was terrifying. It was a language of control so absolute that the gunnery sergeant, who only understood the dialect of brute force and loud commands, was completely deaf to it. His frustration, already simmering, began to boil. He wanted a reaction. He needed one. He needed her to cry, to yell, to run away. He needed her to validate his power. Her refusal to do so was stripping it from him, piece by piece, in front of his men. He was about to escalate further, to grab her arm, to say something even more vile, when the world changed. It began with a sound, a low, guttural moan that seemed to come from the very bones of the earth. It was not the familiar rumble of a passing ship or the roar of a jet from the nearby runway. This was a deeper, more primeval sound. The lights in the bar flickered once, twice, then died, plunging the room into an absolute disorienting darkness. A collective gasp, a chorus of fear, filled the void. Then the emergency lights kicked on, casting the room in a hellish, pulsating red glow. Simultaneously, a series of klaxons began to blare from the direction of the base, a frantic rising and falling shriek that signaled not a drill, but an imminent catastrophe. The very air pressure in the room seemed to drop. The building groaned, a structural sigh of protest as the first gust of wind hit it like a solid object. Panic, a wild and feral animal, was uncaged. Men who had faced down enemy fire in dusty, faraway lands were suddenly reduced to frightened boys in the dark. Voices shouted, chairs were knocked over. The bartender, a grizzled ex-chief, was yelling something about a typhoon, that the forecast had been wrong, that this was a direct hit. The word he used was tokubo, the Japanese meteorological term for a violent, special-class typhoon, the highest possible designation. It wasn't just a storm. It was an extinction-level event for a coastal installation. Gunnery Sergeant Miller, to his credit, tried to assert control. His training kicked in, a Pavlovian response to chaos. "Everybody stay calm," he bellowed, his voice straining to be heard over the rising shriek of the wind and the alarms. "Civilians against the far wall. Military personnel, sound off." His orders were textbook, the kind of thing you learn in a classroom. They were also completely, utterly useless. They were the commands of a man trying to direct traffic in the middle of a landslide. The building shuddered again, more violently this time, and the sound of shattering glass came from the front of the bar as the main window imploded, spraying the room with wind and a horizontal blast of rain that felt like shotgun pellets. The roar of the storm was now inside with them, a deafening, elemental scream. Miller stood there, frozen for a second, his loud authority utterly neutered by a force he could not intimidate, a chaos he could not command. He was a man shouting at the ocean. And then, through the red, strobing darkness and the maelstrom of sound, there was movement. The woman. She rose from her crouch, not in a panic, but with the smooth, deliberate grace of a dancer. The storm that had paralyzed everyone else seemed to have awakened something in her. Her previous stillness was revealed not as passivity, but as a state of coiled potential, a spring that had now been released. Her eyes, which had been flat and analytical, were now blazing with an intensity that seemed to generate its own light in the dim room. She moved through the panicked, scrambling bodies as if they were ghosts, her path a straight, unerring line toward the bar. She vaulted over the bar top in a single, fluid motion, landing silently on the other side. The bartender, fumbling with a dead phone, looked up at her, his face a mask of slack-jawed incomprehension. "Sat phone," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the roar of the wind with the chilling precision of a surgeon's scalpel. It was not a request. It was a statement of absolute, undeniable fact. He was going to give her the satellite phone. The ex-chief, a man who had spent 30 years in the Navy and had seen everything, simply pointed a trembling finger toward a locked cabinet. She didn't wait for a key. She grabbed a heavy-duty bottle opener from the counter and, with a single, perfectly leveraged twist, popped the lock. Inside was a ruggedized, pelican-cased satellite phone. She had it out and was dialing before the broken lock had even hit the floor. Her fingers flew across the keypad with a familiarity that spoke of countless hours of use in the worst conditions imaginable. She put the phone to her ear. "This is designation Sea Dragon," she said, her voice now a clipped, coded language. "I am invoking Protocol 19er Delta. Patch me through to Fleet Weather and Climate Operations Center, Priority 1 Alpha, Authentication Code, Tango Victor 770, now." The name Sea Dragon hung in the air, unheard by most in the chaos, but the tone was unmistakable. It was the sound of supreme command. Gunnery Sergeant Miller, who had been trying to rally his bewildered Marines near the door, heard it. He turned, his face a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. Who was this woman? What was this language she was speaking? She was already receiving a response, her head cocked as she listened. "Negative," she snapped into the phone. "Your models are compromised. You're tracking the eye wall at Vector 090. I am telling you it has shifted. We have an unpredicted cyclonic intensification. The primary eye wall is collapsing and a secondary wall is forming. The surge is going to be at least 5 meters higher than your last projection. Berth 12 is untenable. Repeat, Berth 12 is untenable." She paused, listening. Her eyes scanned the room, not seeing people but assets and liabilities. She was performing a complex, multivariable calculation in her head, factoring in structural integrity, personnel status, and the terrifying, evolving physics of the storm outside. "Get me the duty officer on the USS Lassen. Now," she commanded into the phone. She then turned her attention to the room. Her gaze fell on Miller's Marines. "You!" she shouted, her voice now amplified with the full force of command presence. It cracked like a whip. "I need a damage control party. Find me the building's structural schematics. They're usually posted in the electrical room or janitor's closet. I need to know the load-bearing walls and the location of the gas main. Go." The Marines, trained to respond to decisive orders, simply stared at her for a beat, their brains trying to reconcile the image of the small, quiet woman from 10 minutes ago with the terrifyingly competent commander standing before them. It was Miller who broke the spell. He was still reeling, but his ingrained discipline took over. "You heard her! Move!" he roared at his men, his own voice now an echo of her authority. They scrambled, glad to have a mission, any mission, to distract from the existential terror of the storm. She was back on the phone. "Lassen duty officer? This is Sea Dragon. Who is this?" "Lieutenant? Lieutenant, you are about to lose your ship. Your current mooring configuration will not hold against a 20-foot inverse pressure surge. Do you understand me? You have a catastrophic mooring failure imminent within the next 20 minutes. There was obviously a protest from the other end of the line. The woman's eyes narrowed. "I am not asking for your opinion, Lieutenant. I am giving you a direct order. I am the designated Theater Maritime Disaster Mitigation Authority. You will execute an emergency cast-off. Use your bow thrusters and port screw to pivot and get your bow into the wind. Then use minimal propulsion to get clear of the pier. You have a 10-minute window before the surge makes that impossible. Do you copy? She listened. I don't care who you think I am. Look at your tidal gauge. Look at the barometric pressure. The data is right in front of you. Now execute, or I will have you personally brought up on charges for the loss of a $1.5 billion Arleigh Burke-class destroyer. Your career will be the least of your concerns. Acknowledge the order, Lieutenant. A pause. Then a curt nod. Good. Get it done. She disconnected the call without another word. One of Miller's Marines came running back, a rolled-up set of blueprints in his hand. Ma'am, found them! She took them from him and unrolled them on the sticky surface of the bar, the storm a symphony of destruction around her. The red emergency lights flashed over the complex lines and technical notations. Her finger traced a path across the paper, her mind processing the information with terrifying speed. Here, here, and here, she said, tapping 3 points on the diagram. These are the primary load-bearing walls. The front of this building is a glass curtain wall. It's already failed. The roof is a single-span composite. If the wind gets under it, it will peel off like a tin can lid. We need to mitigate the internal pressure differential. She looked up, her gaze sweeping over the terrified civilians huddled against the wall. We need to break the windows on the leeward side of the building, the side away from the wind. It will allow the pressure to equalize. She pointed at Miller. Gunnery sergeant, take 2 of your men. Use chairs. Break out every window on that wall. Now. Miller, for the first time in his life, did not question an order. He simply said, Aye, ma'am. His voice tight with a respect that was born of pure, unadulterated awe. He grabbed 2 of his youngest Marines, and they went to work, the sound of shattering glass on the far side of the building a counterpoint to the howling wind at the front. The woman was a whirlwind of controlled energy. She directed the remaining people to move tables and heavy furniture against the remaining intact walls, creating reinforced shelters. She had the bartender and other staff gather all the bottled water and first aid kits. She established an impromptu triage station in the most structurally sound corner of the room, anticipating injuries. She moved with a purpose and an understanding of physics, engineering, and human psychology that was nothing short of breathtaking. She was not just managing a crisis. She was conducting it, turning the chaotic noise of the storm into a symphony of survival. And she was the conductor, the composer, and the entire orchestra. The bar had become her command center, the patrons, her troops, and she commanded them not with the borrowed authority of rank, but with the absolute, undeniable power of pure competence. The room, which had been on the verge of a deadly panic, was now a disciplined, functioning unit. They were terrified, yes, but they were busy. They had purpose, and they were following a leader who clearly knew exactly what she was doing. Just as Miller's team finished their task, the main door, which had been shuddering in its frame, was ripped from its hinges and hurtled into the room, followed by a blast of wind and water that knocked several people off their feet. Standing in the gaping doorway, silhouetted against the screaming gray fury of the typhoon, was a figure in full storm gear. He was a tall man, his face grim under the hood of his Gore-Tex parka. He was flanked by 2 Marine security guards in full battle rattle. The man pulled back his hood, revealing the 2 silver stars of a major general on his collar. It was General Davies, the commander of Marine Forces Japan. His eyes, accustomed to the dim light of a tactical operations center, swept the room, taking in the scene of controlled, organized chaos. He saw the broken windows, the furniture barricades, the triage station, He saw Gunnery Sergeant Miller, a senior NCO he knew by sight, directing civilians to safety, his face streaked with grime and rain. The general's gaze continued to scan, searching. He was looking for the source of this impossible order in the midst of pandemonium. And then he saw her. She was standing at the bar, the satellite phone once again pressed to her ear, the blueprints spread out before her like a general's battle map. The general's entire posture changed in an instant. The weary, battle-hardened commander vanished, replaced by something else entirely. His back straightened, his shoulders squared, and his heels came together with an audible click, even on the wet floor. It was the sharpest, most profound position of attention a man of his age and rank could assume. "Attention on deck!" he bellowed, his voice a cannon shot that momentarily overpowered the storm. It was an instinctual, ingrained reaction for every service member in the room. Gunnery Sergeant Miller and his Marines, scattered throughout the bar, snapped to attention, their bodies rigid, their eyes locked forward. The civilians, confused but sensing the immense gravity of the moment, fell silent and shrunk back. The command was absolute. But it was not directed at the general. The general himself was standing at attention. He was directing the respect of the room toward the small, unassuming woman at the bar. She finished her sentence into the phone, confirm secondary surge vector, and advise all hands to abandon pier-side operations, Sea Dragon out, and slowly lowered it. She turned and her pale blue eyes met the general's. There was a moment of silent communication between them, a shared understanding that transcended rank and circumstance. Gunnery Sergeant Miller, his mind struggling to process the impossible scene before him, finally found his voice. It was a choked, broken whisper. He looked at the general, his face a canvas of utter bewilderment. "Sir, General, who is she?" General Davies did not break his rigid posture. He did not look at Miller. His eyes remained fixed on the woman. He let the question hang in the air for a long, torturous moment, allowing the full weight of Miller's catastrophic ignorance to settle upon him. Then the general spoke, his voice cold and hard as forged steel. "That, Gunnery Sergeant," he began, each word a hammer blow, "is not a she. That is Commander Evelyn Reed. To you and to every other living soul on this base, her call sign is Ghost Viper." He finally turned his head, his eyes boring into Miller's. The look was not one of anger. It was a look of profound, soul-crushing disappointment. "And the only reason your Marines are not currently floating face down in the harbor alongside the wreckage of a billion-dollar destroyer is because she, from this bar, with a sat phone and a napkin, single-handedly rewrote our entire typhoon contingency plan in the last 15 minutes. The name descended on the room like a physical weight. Commander Evelyn Reed. Ghost Viper. The words meant nothing to the civilians, but to the military personnel, it was as if the general had just announced the presence of a deity. The legend was whispered in intelligence circles, in naval special warfare training schools, in the hushed halls of the Pentagon. Commander Reed, the ghost. The woman with a doctorate in oceanic and atmospheric sciences from MIT and another in strategic risk assessment. The youngest officer ever to complete the Navy's full suite of special warfare qualifications, including BUD/S, but whose real value was not in her trigger finger, but in her brain. She was a weapon system of a different kind. She didn't fight enemies, she fought chaos, she fought physics. She was the Navy's ultimate troubleshooter, a living legend sent to the world's worst disasters to predict the unpredictable and manage the unmanageable. Her call sign, Ghost Viper, was a nod to her methods. She would appear without warning, strike at the heart of a problem with lethal precision, and vanish, leaving behind only stability and a string of awestruck flag officers. She was a myth, and she was standing right in front of them, her clothes still damp from a spilled glass of water. The narrator could have stepped in then, to list her accolades like a herald. The Navy Cross, awarded for actions during a submarine rescue under the polar ice cap, the details of which were still classified. The 2 Defense Distinguished Service Medals, the fact that she had literally written the book, the Navy's primary operational doctrine on extreme weather event mitigation. Her face looked plain because it had never appeared in a single official photograph. Her name was almost always redacted from public reports. She was a ghost, a legend. And Gunnery Sergeant Miller had told her she was in the wrong bar. The crisis, thanks to her intervention, was managed. The storm passed, leaving a trail of destruction, but a fraction of what it would have been. The Lassen had made it to open water. The piers, though damaged, had held. Lives were saved. Order was restored. In the gray, wet dawn that followed, as damage assessment teams fanned out across the base, Commander Reed stood with General Davies and Gunnery Sergeant Miller near the ruined entrance of the bar. The general looked at Miller. "Gunnery Sergeant, I don't even know where to begin with the UCMJ violations. Article 91, insubordinate conduct toward a superior commissioned officer. Article 117, provoking speeches and gestures. Article 134, general misconduct." Miller stood rigidly, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the ground. He was prepared to accept any punishment, any disgrace. He deserved it. But then Commander Reed held up a hand. "No, General," she said, her voice back to its quiet, calm default. "That would be inefficient." She turned to Miller. For the first time, she looked at him not as a specimen, but as a person. A flawed, ignorant, but ultimately salvageable person. "Gunnery Sergeant," she began, her tone clinical, as if delivering a post-mission debrief. "Your failure was not one of disrespect. A personal insult is irrelevant. Your failure was tactical. It was a failure of assessment. You saw a small woman in civilian clothes and you made an assumption. You allowed your prejudices to overwrite your training, which should have taught you to observe, assess, and act based on data, not on ego." She took a step closer. "In my world, an assumption like that doesn't get you a reprimand. It gets you, and everyone who depends on you, killed. You did not see a potential asset. You did not see a neutral party. You saw a target for your own insecurities. Your need to establish dominance in a trivial situation nearly blinded you to the one person in that room who could save you from a lethal one. That is a flaw in your operational software, and it needs to be corrected." She looked back at the general. "He doesn't need the brig, sir. He needs an education." She then fixed her gaze back on the utterly humbled Marine. "Gunnery Sergeant Miller, effective 0800 tomorrow. You are assigned to my command on temporary duty. You will be my personal aide. You will carry my analysis kit. You will sit in on my briefings with fleet admirals. You will take notes while I redesign the coastal surge barriers for this entire installation. You will observe. You will learn. You will see what actual authority, the kind that is earned through competence, not conferred by rank, looks like. You will continue in this role until I am satisfied that you have learned the difference between strength and posturing. Is that understood?" Miller's head snapped up. His eyes were wide with a dawning understanding. This was not a punishment. This was a crucible. It was a far more profound sentence than any court-martial. It was a forced re-education at the hands of the very master he had mocked. He swallowed hard, the lump in his throat feeling like a stone. "Yes, ma'am," he choked out. "Crystal clear, Commander." The story of that night passed into the permanent lore of the Seventh Fleet. It became known as the Typhoon in the O Club, though it was a dive bar or Miller's education. The legend grew with each telling. The storm became bigger, the bar more crowded, the gunnery sergeant's insults more cartoonishly vile. But the core of the story, the essential truth of it, remained intact. It became a teaching tool, a modern military fable passed down from salty chiefs to boot lieutenants, from grizzled gunnies to fresh-faced privates. It was a story about the dangers of assumption. Years passed. In a brightly lit classroom at the Staff Non-Commissioned Officer Academy in Quantico, Virginia, a new generation of Marine sergeants sat listening to their instructor. He was a master gunnery sergeant now, a man whose presence filled the room not with noise, but with a quiet, profound gravity. His face was a roadmap of a hard-lived life, but his eyes were clear, calm, and missed nothing. It was Master Gunnery Sergeant Miller. He stood before his class of young, proud, bulletproof NCOs, the future leaders of the Corps. "Let me tell you a story," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It's about the most profound professional humiliation of my life. It took place in a dive bar in Yokosuka, Japan. And it began because I saw a small, quiet woman, and I decided I knew exactly who and what she was without a single shred of evidence." He told them the whole story. He spared himself no embarrassment. He recounted his own arrogant words, his petty actions, the towering height of his own stupidity. He described her unnatural calm, her shocking competence, the moment a two-star general snapped to attention for her. He told them about his education, the 6 months he spent trailing Commander Evelyn Reed, watching her outthink, outplan, and outlead men who had spent their entire lives in command. He described watching her brief the Joint Chiefs with the same calm, dispassionate authority she had used to order him to break windows in a bar. When he finished, the room was utterly silent. The young sergeants, who had walked in full of the same unearned confidence he once had, were looking at him with a new, dawning respect. "Your rank," Miller told them, his voice soft but carrying to the far corners of the room, "is a key. It opens doors. It gives you positional authority. But it is not the source of power. True power, true authority comes from competence. It comes from what you know, what you can do, and the character you show when everything is on the line. The loudest voice in the room is often the most insecure. The quietest person might be the one holding it all together. Your job as a leader is not to prove you are the strongest. It is to have the wisdom to identify strength in whatever form it appears, and use it. Never, ever judge the book by its cover. Because one day, you might find that the plain, unassuming paperback in the corner of the room is the one that can save your life. And so the lesson lived on. It was a story born of arrogance and a storm, but it became a testament to a universal and timeless truth. True strength does not need to announce itself. It does not boast. It does not posture. It simply is. It is the quiet professional, the hidden master, the one who waits, who watches, who knows. It is the substance that endures long after the style has faded. It is the calm voice that cuts through the chaos, the steady hand that rights the ship. It is the understanding that respect is not demanded by a uniform or a title, but commanded by action. Let your work be your argument. Let your competence be your creed. In a world full of noise, the greatest power belongs to those who have earned the right to be silent. For when they finally speak, the world listens.